Good evening. Hello. It's great to have you with us tonight, both in person and for those of us joining on Zoom. I'm Josh Brumberg, the interim president of the CUNY Graduate Center, and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to our annual Otto and Fran Walter Memorial Lecture, which is a time for us to focus on the relationship between Europe and the United States. Otto Walter, a generous benefactor of the Graduate Center's European Union Studies Center, fled Nazi Germany as a young man. As an immigrant to this country, he focused the rest of his life on building a better tomorrow. Through its research and teaching, the Graduate Center too seeks to create a brighter and more peaceful future. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the Graduate Center is the primary doctoral degree granting institution of the City University of New York, the nation's largest urban public university. We offer 48 doctoral and master's degrees from astrophysics to urban education. And we have a long and distinguished history of conducting innovative research that has public impact. We are proud to house more than 30 research centers and institutes that carry on this important mission. The Ralph Bunche Institute, the co-sponsor of tonight's event, is one such institute. Since 1973, the Institute has sought to improve the scholarly and public understanding of international affairs and to contribute through its research and scholarship to solving international problems. Our conversation this evening with our two distinguished speakers aligns perfectly with that crucial goal. We are honored to be joined tonight by Dr. Karen Donfried. Dr. Donfried is a senior fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Just last spring, she stepped down as Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. In that role, she served as the Secretary of State Anthony Blinken's top advisor on Europe and Eurasia and led the largest regional bureau at the State Department with 12,000 employees covering 50 countries during Russia's war against Ukraine. She is also a special assistant to she was also a special assistant to President Obama and Senior Director for European Affairs on the National Security Council at the White House. Dr. Donfried will be in conversation with our own John Torpey, Director of the Ralph Bunche Institute and Presidential Professor of Sociology and History at the Graduate Center. He is the author and editor of several books that address the collapse of communism in East Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the regulation of migration, and the problem of coming to terms with the past in international politics. He also hosts the Ralph Bunche Institute's International Horizons podcast, in which he conducts conversations with prominent scholars, journalists, and policymakers about the latest international issues. I know that you will enjoy tonight's discussion, and I hope that you will join us for some of our other upcoming public programs. They include our lively dissertation showcase a week from tonight, and a book talk on Underground Empire, How America Weaponized the World Economy on May 22nd. You can learn more about these and other happenings on our website, gc.cuny.edu. And now I turn the evening over to Professor Torpey. John?
Thank you. This is working. Everybody can hear me, even out there in Zoom land. Just wave. Okay. It's great to have Karen Donfried here. I was puzzling before she arrived this evening about how long I've known her, and I realized I haven't known her all that long, but we've had sort of parallel lives and parallel advisors and all those sorts of things through our academic and subsequent careers. So it's great to have you here. Thank you so much for taking the time and the trouble to get here. So we have about 45 minutes to have this conversation, and I think probably the obvious place to start, since it's part of the title of the event, is with Ukraine, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine that has so upset prior relationships and is remaking international affairs, certainly in Europe. There were major hopes last spring about this counteroffensive, that this was really going to change the situation, the battlefield situation on the ground. but this has not really come to pass, and now Vladimir Putin is rattling sabers, technical nuclear weapons as sabers, in what he says is a response to NATO, the possibility of a deeper intervention by NATO in Ukraine, particularly French President Emmanuel Macron's refusal to preclude putting NATO soldiers on the ground. So I wonder if you could start by telling us, how you think things stand in Ukraine and whether you see a way out of the conflict.
Well, thanks so much. It's such a privilege to be here for the Otto and Fran Walter Memorial Lecture. I loved what you said, that when Otto Walter came to the US, he dedicated himself to building a better tomorrow. And that seems like a great goal for all of us to be dedicated to. So it's lovely to be here for that. And it's great to be having this conversation with John. We thought it would be a lot more fun for us to have a conversation than for me to deliver a formal lecture. So Ukraine has taken up a lot of my bandwidth, certainly since February 24, 2022. And if we think about where things are today on the ground in Ukraine, one of your questions, the Ukrainians are in a really difficult spot. They are trying to defend a very long front line across the north-south border, bending to the east. And they're behind the 8 ball because, as we know, they've been very dependent on the United States for the military equipment they're using to try to push back the unprovoked Russian full-scale invasion of their country. And this last supplemental appropriations request, as you know, took 6 months to get through the Congress. And that meant that the Ukrainians were rationing ammo and artillery, rationing the air defense munitions. So the Russians had an opportunity to take advantage of that. That said, the front line has not moved all that much. We did see the Russians take the town of Avdiivka in the southeastern part of Ukraine. That happened in mid-February. There was a great concern that that would give the Russians a toehold, which would allow them to break through that front line. Just this week, they took a few more villages near Avdiivka, but we haven't seen that big break that we were frankly very concerned about. The Russians have done tremendous damage to civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. Among other things, they've been targeting the energy infrastructure, and they've been so successful at that because of the lack of air defense munitions. So the Ukrainians haven't been able to shoot down those missiles because they just didn't have those air defense munitions. So it's a very challenging battlefield for Ukraine right now. Obviously, our equipment is now getting to Ukraine. Some of it was pre-positioned, that got there quickly. They're waiting on other things. But we don't know how long it will take the Ukrainians to stabilize that front line. And they're also very focused on building defensive lines should the Russians break through at some point that they then can hold them back. So complicated battlefield right now for the Ukrainians. I think the Russians were hoping they might have had a gift for Putin's inauguration yesterday in terms of a serious breakthrough. I think now they're focused on the NATO summit, which will take place in Washington in early July. It's NATO's 75th anniversary, so the Russians will be quite happy to have a significant breakthrough by then, but we'll just have to see how the battle proceeds. And then the question you asked essentially about how does this end? I think everyone's crystal ball is a little bit cloudy. What the Biden administration committed to was standing with Ukraine for as long as it takes. There was a lot of questioning about whether the administration could stay true to that pledge if it wasn't able to get the supplemental appropriations bill through, but fortunately that happened. And I think the administration is focused on trying to have Putin adjust his mindset. I think from the beginning, Putin has been convinced that he cares more about Ukraine than the US, Europe, and other allies of ours do, and that he has greater staying power than us weak-kneed liberal democracies. And one of the important messages of getting that aid package through was showing that there is still a broad bipartisan consensus in support of Ukraine in this country. So if you can adjust his mindset, and this gets back to the counteroffensive, so the hope had been the Ukrainians last year, through that offensive, would have been able to break Russia's land bridge to Crimea. So you probably know the Kerch Strait Bridge connects mainland Russia to Crimea, which the Russians have occupied since 2014. But Crimea essentially has been the back office for Russia's war against Ukraine. And so the hope was if we could break that land bridge, it would be much more difficult for Putin to resupply those Russian forces. They didn't achieve that. But what we're seeing today is that the Ukrainians are effectively using the long-range missiles that the British and the French had given to the Ukrainians already last year. The US just made the decision to supply the Ukrainians with those weapons recently. But that's allowed the Ukrainians to hit targets in Crimea. So they've used their drones to hit about a third of the Black Sea Fleet. So you saw Putin move the Black Sea Fleet farther back. And now, with these long-range missiles, they're hitting Russian air bases and other things on Crimea. So the hope is that we can show, no, we're as committed to this as you are. And I'll stop in a minute, but I just want to be clear about why it matters that we stay the course. Of course, this is existential for Ukraine. And I repeat, there was nothing Ukraine did to provoke a full-scale Russian invasion of its territory. Russia has a population of about 140 million. Ukraine, before the war, had a population of about 40 million. Russia is a much larger country with a much more powerful military. So, yes, this is existential for Ukraine. It matters tremendously for European security. Ukraine is not in NATO, but Ukraine has a lot of neighbors that are in NATO, and we have a security commitment to those countries. But also, it's about global stability. And you probably haven't read the United Nations Charter recently. It's maybe not that scintillating a document, but it captures principles that we've committed ourselves to about respecting other countries' sovereignty, respecting their territorial integrity, the fact that each country should have the right to determine its own foreign and security policy future. Essentially, might doesn't make right. And this is a very clear case of one country trying to seize the sovereign territory of its weaker neighbor. And so I know President Biden feels very strongly that if we don't stand up for that principle, there are lots of countries in other parts of the world that would be happy to seize their weaker neighbor's territory. And that's not a world that we want to live in. So the stakes here are high.
Clearly. So your comments remind me that we will come back to this, and we'll have time for questions and answers starting at around 7:25, 7:30. So I'm going to ask a question about Germany, but you can come back to this, obviously, in the Q&A. So one of the consequences of the Russian invasion in February of 2022 was a rather surprising reaction, at least for many people, from the German government, from the relatively newly elected German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who announced this so-called Zeitenwende, which basically means a kind of watershed or transformation in German foreign and military policy, and that they were going to basically take on a much more substantial role in defending Europe, basically. And There are questions about how much that actually happened, but Germany is the #2 contributor to the defense of Ukraine in monetary terms. So it's not as if nothing has happened. But I wonder whether you could talk a little bit about the consequences that the Ukraine invasion has had in Germany, which has tended to become a kind of, I don't want to say pacifist country, but not very enthusiastic about the idea of military engagement, military involvement of Germany in foreign engagements and that sort of thing. So you're the former president of the German Marshall Fund, so I suspect you have a lot to say about this.
Well, thanks for that. And maybe we should start by remembering that today is May 8. And for all of us Euro wonks, May 8 is Victory in Europe Day. And today we are celebrating the 79th anniversary of VE Day. So this was the day that Germany unconditionally surrendered to the Allies. 79 years ago, for some people, will seem like a very long time ago, but we still have Americans, Germans, Europeans, global citizens who have living memories of VE Day. And West Germany and the United Germany took a lot of lessons from World War II. And the pacifism you referred to comes from a sense that maybe we Germans shouldn't play a military role in future. And I won't go through the whole history of how we got here, but one of the many decisions Germany made at the end of World War II was that it would not send weapons to a conflict zone. So we're going to fast forward now to February of 2022. I think, as many people know, the US believed that Putin was planning a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. We started seeing intelligence in October of 2021 that convinced us Putin was serious about this. And I was one of several senior administration officials who traveled to meet with allies and say, we're going to be sharing through intelligence channels what we're seeing, but I need to share some bad news with you. We assess that Putin is going to undertake this full-scale invasion. And not all of our European allies shared that assessment. They looked at the intelligence. In fact, you could actually see how Putin was deploying forces along 3 edges of Ukraine's borders. But many of our allies believed at the end of the day, Putin was trying to put pressure on us, but wouldn't invade because he had too much to lose than to gain through such an invasion. And this then unfolds on February 24. And I had a German friend a few days later say, Karen, this is Germany's 9/11. Most of us Germans did not believe this was going to happen. And I think that is why you saw Olaf Scholz, as you noted, the relatively new Chancellor of Germany, 3 days later on a Sunday, February 27, call a special session of the Bundestag to give this Zeitenwende speech. And there were many things he announced in that speech. One of them was, we're going to support Ukraine, and that means sending weapons to Ukraine. So there goes that. Germany doesn't send weapons to a conflict zone. He also acknowledged that this has changed fundamentally the European security landscape. And we have to acknowledge that, and we need a more capable Bundeswehr. We need a more capable German military. So I'm going to create a special fund of 100 billion euros to build that more capable Bundeswehr. I won't go through all the things he announced, but this is why it was highly significant. And to your point, today, Germany is the second largest provider of weapons to Ukraine. Who would have thought that? It's really striking. And You know, it's funny because a lot of German friends would come to me when I was in the administration and say, Karen, you've got to criticize the Germans. I mean, we Germans need to move more quickly. We need to do more. And I said, look, you as a German citizen can criticize your government, but we in the Biden administration appreciate the speech the chancellor gave and the strides he is taking to implement these policy changes. So can we all do more and do it more quickly? Sure, but I think we have to acknowledge what a substantial change this is for Germany.
Well, and this discussion continues with the defense minister's notion that the German armed forces have to become, the word is kriegstüchtig, which means sort of capable of fighting a war, which sounds ambiguous about under what circumstances that might happen, so that could make people nervous. But I wonder if you could comment on the discussion that's going on in Germany and how this notion is being received, because of course it's not been received necessarily all that enthusiastically, because it butts up against this kind of sense that we shouldn't be involved in those kinds of things. But it may need to be involved in those kinds of things is the problem.
Well, I'm not sure that anybody wants to be involved in war, for sure. And this is a reality now on the European continent in a way that it hasn't been since World War II. So this is a serious thing. This is not, you know, I remember I was working at the Congressional Research Service during the Balkan Wars in the 90s, and I remember thinking, this is probably the last time we're going to see war on the European continent in my lifetime. Well, whoops, that was wrong. And, you know, if you talk to a Balt or a Pole, they are convinced that if Putin is not stopped in Ukraine, he will test the NATO alliance. So war in Europe is a concept that isn't just theoretical anymore. And I think what's very challenging for Germany right now is you have a complicated three-party coalition that is extremely unpopular, and you have in the chancellor's party probably the most concern about Germany playing a larger military role. So this is challenging for the chancellor in political terms and in domestic politics, broadly speaking. So this is, it's real. Germany is coming to terms with playing a role it hasn't played in recent memory. And there is a conversation among Germans about whether, do we really want to play this role? And can't we just end this somehow? Isn't there a negotiation we can have just to stop this? So the stakes are higher than they have been for a very long time.
Certainly seems that way. So to broaden out the conversation from Germany a little bit to Germany and France. I mean, Germany and France played a role during Angela Merkel's long stay in the chancellor's office that helped, I think many people felt like, helped stabilize Europe. And now that partnership is, in any case, not what it once was with Angela Merkel. And Emmanuel Macron seems to be very concerned about, you know, putting forward French strategic autonomy is the term. And in any case, not necessarily cooperating with the German chancellor. So I wonder what you would say about why that's happening and what's going on and where is that going to lead?
Well, I don't think we should over-romanticize Angela Merkel's relationship, actually, with Macron. I think one of the reasons the Franco-German relationship has been so important to the European Union, to European unity, to progress toward deeper European integration is because the French and the Germans often do not have the same view. So if a French president and a German chancellor can agree on a policy prescription and a way forward, you can bring much of Europe along with you. That's still true in an enlarged EU, though it is important to also have the Poles there. And this is why the Weimar Triangle is also a really interesting construction. But there's no question that Macron and Scholz, they're different personalities, they express themselves differently, they see things differently, but they also understand the importance of European unity. And just to take a very recent example, wasn't it interesting to see Macron and his wife and Scholz and his wife have dinner in Paris before the visit of Xi to France and now Serbia and Hungary? So Scholz had just been in China. He had a planned visit to the Baltics. He didn't stay in Paris. But to see the two leaders make sure that they met and engaged, and then to have von der Leyen, who of course is president of the European Commission, a German who is a Christian Democrat, not a social democrat, participate in that meeting, was another important moment of showing European unity in terms of the relationship with China. But if you read the recent things Macron has been saying, his Sorbonne speech is really worth reading. His interview in The Economist is really worth reading. And I suppose as an American, you could say, wait a minute, what, strategic autonomy? Autonomy from whom? Us. Strategic vassal of the United States? Should we take offense at that? Well, you know, what Macron is putting a spotlight on is if the US Congress had not passed that supplemental appropriation, the plain truth of the matter is Europe would not have been able to fill in that hole. And I think Macron is saying that is unacceptable. We Europeans need to be capable of defending our own continent. And how do you create the political will to do that? It's easy to rely on the United States, but maybe the United States isn't so reliable anymore. And that doesn't just mean under a different US president. You could also look at the 6 months where that assistance didn't get through Congress and say, gosh, even when Joe Biden, this dyed-in-the-wool transatlanticist, was president, he couldn't get that assistance through. So that's a powerful message. And I think we Americans, rather than debating strategic autonomy, and we really don't like that phrase, should think about how we can help our European allies and partners be more effective and be more capable in the military sphere. Because I believe it is fundamentally in the interest of this country to have that more capable Europe.
Well, and I think American leaders have been arguing for this for a long time. I mean, Donald Trump made a lot of noises about it, but he wasn't the first to make this kind of demand. I mean, I guess the only question I have in response to what you just said is sort of the question whether things don't push in a direction of, you know, the Europeans moving away from us. And that leads me, in a way, to the next question I wanted to ask, which has to do with China, a force, you know, from outside the European or transatlantic context that is now increasingly, you know, in Europe. They own properties there. I gather there's a train line that's been built from Piraeus to Hungary. And it's a very kind of strange situation from the point of view of those of us who, you know, grew up in a situation in which China was not an particularly active player in Europe. It was not particularly in a position to really do that. And now the official doctrine, as I understand it, of the 27-member European Union defines China as, quote, a partner for cooperation, an economic competitor, and a systemic rival. And that's a very complicated set of criteria to work with. So I wonder what you would say about China's role in Europe and the idea that, you know, Europe is in a certain sense now playing this kind of balancing act between us and the Chinese. And that, it seems to me, is a very dramatically different situation than the one you and I grew up with.
I don't think I would describe it quite that way, that Europe is playing a balancing act between us and the Chinese. I think the Europeans are very clear and explicit publicly that they are allied with the United States. And their characterization of the relationship with China is frankly not that different from the US description. The Biden administration talks about wanting to cooperate with China on issues like climate change and AI. We talk about competing with China economically. And we also talk about rivalry. And what the administration is trying to do is prevent that competition from becoming conflict. I think the European view of China has changed fundamentally in the recent past. I think Europe did see China primarily through the economic lens because it was so important to the European economy. Or take the German case, so important to the German car industry, among other things. But many things have happened that have changed the European view. You know, you think about the Belt and Road Initiative, where that was about China coming to Europe and buying up strategic infrastructure. You mentioned Piraeus, the port of Piraeus, and other things. And the Europeans got a little worried about that. And then Huawei and 5G, and wait a minute, is this going to be a Chinese backdoor into our telecom system? And the treatment of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, human rights concerns. I mean, there are a whole list of things that have happened, including now Chinese support for Russia in its war against Ukraine. And now I think every European sees that China presents a direct threat to European security. Russia would be in a very different place today were it not getting economic and political support from China. I mean, remember, in the immediate run-up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine in early February of 2022, Xi and Putin announced the No Limits Partnership. And that has really turned out to be very beneficial to both sides, actually. And I think Europeans are very aware of this. Are there differences in the relationship? Of course. But I do think Europeans are much more concerned about how to manage their relationship with China and protect their interests today. So in that sense, I see more commonality between the US and the European positions than dissonance.
Okay, now I want to follow up with a question that's less geopolitical and more about what's going on the ground in these countries, and that is the phenomenon of, you know, more or less mass immigration from, you know, the peripheral countries, North Africa, Turkey, etc., that are, you know, in fact, changing the demographic patterns of these countries, and, you know, partially this also has to do with religious changes, a change of the religious coloration, so to speak, of the population. And I guess I wonder, you know, how you see that from the point of view of somebody who's really more concerned about geopolitical matters. You know, how do you see that affecting European societies? How successful do you think they're being at addressing these kinds of changes, and what consequences is going to have for European life?
So, you know, first, I think it's important to point out that the migration pressure on Europe is a long-term challenge. You know, sometimes we think about it through the lens of crises. We understand why Afghan migration peaked, why Syrians were coming to Europe, why Ukrainians have been coming to Europe. But climate change means there's going to be long-term pressure on Europe, particularly from the African continent. So this is a long-term challenge. Second, I think we have to acknowledge that our country struggles with the immigration challenge in the same way that every European country is. And I don't think any of us have figured out a humane solution to this problem yet. So this is something, a shared challenge. And third, we have to acknowledge, if you look at the rise of the far right in every European country, the major issue that they are getting support on is how to handle migration. So there is tremendous pressure on every national government in Europe and on the European Union to figure out how to manage this. And I think you've seen the balance of opinion really turn much more anti-immigrant than it's been. And this is a factor, again, both in European elections, which will take place in early June, but also in national elections. So I think this pressure is going to continue. We are all going to struggle with how do we manage this in a way that answers what our citizens are asking for, but also respects the rights of people who are in very difficult situations.
Right. I mean, but one asks oneself whether people appreciate that, you know, the European demographic structure is such that, you know, they need labor power. They need younger people to support, you know, the aging people who are getting Social Security or their equivalents in Europe. So I wonder whether that argument is going to cut any ice, or is the differentness of these immigrants more salient?
So I think it depends on who you talk to in Europe. So if you talk to European private sector folks, they say the demographic challenge is enormous and we need migration because our workforce is declining. If you talk to far-right politicians, they say, well, we have a choice and we're going to choose a smaller economy because we don't want that. So it depends on who you talk to, what the answer to that is, but you're absolutely right that there's an enormous demographic challenge facing Europe.
No question about it. So, I mean, another issue that has, I think, contributed to the far-right challenge is the kind of sense that the European Union is a remote, distant entity that normal people have nothing really to do with, don't have any influence over. It's the familiar notion of the so-called democratic deficit, and I wonder, you know, how you see that situation. I mean, is there any prospect of that improving? What do the elections foretell for us that are really just a month away?
So the importance of the European Parliament elections are that this is the one directly elected institution in the European Union, the European Parliament. And it's really quite remarkable to think of this election happening across 27 EU member states over a few days. I mean, the population of the European Union is about 450 million. So maybe the electorate is 360 million. So let's imagine you have 360 million Europeans going to vote. Well, you won't, because you won't have 100% participation, and that's going to be a big question. I mean, normally you have about 50% participation in European Parliament elections, and as we know, lower voter turnout helps the parties of the extreme. There was a recent Eurobarometer survey that had 70% of respondents saying, I'm going to vote in European Parliament elections. That would be pretty remarkable if that happens. I'm not sure they're going to hit 70%, but everybody seems to believe that the headline coming out of the European Parliament elections will be the far-right parties have done better than they've ever done in the past. And, you know, what we've seen in the past 2 European Parliament elections is decreasing support for established parties. So the populism that is roiling American politics is roiling European politics. And, you know, in the European Parliament, you know, as probably many of you know, the way the Parliament is organized is through political party groups. So you mix nationalities, and traditionally the 2 largest political party groups have been sort of the center-right and the center-left. And polls suggest that the center-right grouping will remain the largest grouping in the parliament, but the center-left is going to decrease. And, you know, nobody thinks that there's going to be a far-right supergroup that will dominate the parliament. And frankly, what we've seen traditionally is the far right is split among themselves. There are ideological differences, there are personality conflicts. So it's not so much that, or at least what I am worried about is not so much that the far right will dominate policymaking, but that you're seeing this fracturing of the European political party system, and that makes it harder to be ambitious as a European Union, to implement ambitious policy choices. And I would argue the European Union today is pretty ambitious. If you look at the Green New Deal, if you look at some of the tech legislation they put in place, and perhaps most importantly, if you look at Ukraine. I mean, the European Union has created new instruments. It's using old instruments in ways you never would have imagined because, as Ursula von der Leyen had said, I will lead a geopolitical commission. And we all thought, yeah. Well, she actually has led a geopolitical commission because of the very real challenge of this Russian invasion of Ukraine. That ambition I like, but I worry that if you have this fractured political situation, it becomes much more difficult to meet those ambitions and to create more ambitious policy.
Right. So now a question about NATO. I think many people who observe NATO, not so long ago said, what is NATO's purpose? It's not really necessary anymore. It was meant to keep, the Americans in, the Germans down, and the Russians out. But people weren't worried about the Russians invading. So, of course, now people have seemingly a different view of NATO and its purpose. And, of course, it's grown in the course of the Ukrainian conflict. So I wonder if you could comment on what place you see NATO as having in the European security architecture and in the future.
So I certainly remember Joe Biden campaigning last time on wanting to revitalize U.S. alliances and partnerships. And he very much believes that the United States is stronger in the world when we're managing challenges with like-minded countries. And he invested a lot of time in his first year in office in revitalizing NATO and revitalizing our relationship with the European Union, which I think has served him very well. And, we can talk about the utility or lack of utility of NATO, but I do think NATO has played a role in the fact that we haven't had great power conflict since the end of World War II, and I really hope we can continue to maintain that. But since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, anyone who was uncertain about why NATO was relevant was reminded. And if we see what's happened among NATO allies over the past 2+ years, whether it's buttressing NATO's eastern flank, and we mentioned Germany. I mean, one of the things Germany has done is sent a battle group to Lithuania. It's really quite striking. But beyond what NATO itself is doing, and you also see about 2/3 of NATO members now meet that spending 2% of your GDP on defense. That's a guideline that NATO has. And we see the Brits now saying 2.5% for NATO's 75th anniversary summit. And the Brits are doing it, but they're trying to embolden other NATO members to increase that guideline. Beyond what NATO members are doing, I did not think in my lifetime I would see Finland and Sweden join NATO. Finland and Sweden both believed they were better off outside NATO, was militarily non-aligned, and that NATO was better off, actually. And that changed overnight for the then Finnish president, Sauli Niinisto, because he said deterrence failed. Russia has just invaded a non-NATO country. And I, as president of Finland, am not comfortable keeping my country out of NATO. I owe it to my citizens to change my policy. I think Sweden was less convinced, but Finland and Sweden, their security is so intertwined, the Swedish then made the same decision. And, I think about Vladimir Putin, who so often has said, I had to invade Ukraine because NATO was getting so close to my borders. He just doubled NATO's border with Russia. Finland has an 830-mile border with Russia. So, wow, that is a strategic defeat for Vladimir Putin, if that was a concern of his. So what NATO is today with 32 countries is something quite different from what it was on February 23rd, 2022.
Right, but we're about to have an election in the United States where this may play a certain role. It's not news, I don't think, to anyone that Donald Trump has not been very excited about NATO as an institution, as an organization. He has an odd affinity for the views and preferences of some of the people that NATO is meant to defend against. And I think it's fair to say that, at least what I hear, there's a fair amount of alarm about the possibility that Trump will win re-election in November. So I wonder what you would say about that eventuality, and how worried are you?
So our NATO allies listen closely when former President Trump speaks, and they have heard him say that if a NATO member is not spending 2% of its GDP on defense, then Russia should do, I think the quote is whatever the hell it wants. And that actually has not been the operating principle of NATO. This is an alliance, and we've all made security commitments to each other. And it is not that you look and see the percentage of GDP that that country is spending. I think every NATO member should spend 2% of its GDP on defense, and I actually agree with the Brits. We should raise that to 2.5% of GDP, because I think there is a serious security challenge that Europe is facing today, and everybody needs to take that seriously, and they need to show they're taking it seriously by contributing appropriately. But I think the idea that this somehow is a dues-paying club and you can't use the dining room if you're not paying your full dues, that's never what NATO has been. Fundamentally, NATO is an alliance of like-minded countries. What unites NATO members fundamentally is not the percentage of GDP we're spending on defense. It's that we believe that of all the forms of government we have experimented with, liberal democracy, small L liberal democracy, is the most likely to provide prosperity, security, equality for its citizens. That's what this is about. And you somehow cheapen that if you turn it into, well, wait, how much are you paying this year? So we can't lose sight of what ultimately unites NATO members, and why, if there's a country that meets those criteria, you keep that open door to NATO. And surely Finland and Sweden do. So, of course, there's concern in Europe about that, but we also have to be honest that if you're talking about a Viktor Orban in Hungary, he would welcome a Trump victory. And, for any of you who watch Hungary, Orban has taken a page out of the Trump playbook. He now talks about mega, make Europe great again. And, what Orban is saying is, I don't want Hungary to leave the European Union. I want to reshape the European Union. And I don't mean liberal democracy. I want an illiberal Christian democracy. That's the Europe I want to build. And that far-right plurality that we are likely to see in the European Parliament surely gets emboldened with a victory of Donald Trump. So the same tensions and stresses that we have here in the United States, with many Americans saying, well, I don't think liberal democracy has delivered all that well for me. Those questions are there in Europe. So it's complicated. And how this plays out, I think this is why so many feel this is, I think it's the most consequential US election in my lifetime, because it's about what kind of country do we want to have, and what do we feel America means? Is it still this shining city on the hill, as Ronald Reagan termed it, or is it something else?
Well, this is obviously a central question that faces us, and I think, I want to widen the aperture out a little bit more to a kind of final question from me before we go to Q&A about, the nature of world order today. I want you to be grand and grandiose about, how you see this, but, many people have kind of divided the world into this division between democracies and autocracies. The West, the transatlantic countries, some countries in the Pacific Rim on the one side, and then on the other side, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. One problem with that arrangement is, as you've just suggested, that we have a fly in the ointment when it comes to being clear about who and what we are. So I wonder how you would comment on this kind of separation of these two, if you like, camps. That's the way the world now could be seen and should be seen. There were these democracy summits that the Biden administration put together early in the administration, and people had questions about that, again, to some degree simply because of the presence of Trump. And, where is he going to take us if we reelect him? So how do you see this configuration of world order?
I actually really like that this is your last question, because in many ways it takes us back to your first question, where I was saying I think Ukraine matters for global stability and global order. And let me say a little bit more about that. You mentioned China, Russia, North Korea, Iran. And there are many folks who are calling that quad the axis of autocracy. And there's a vibrant debate about this. Is it really an axis of autocracy? Or is it an axis of convenience, an axis of anti-Americanism? What is the staying power of this axis, et cetera, et cetera? And we don't have to debate that here, but I think it's fair to debate it because we don't actually know. But certainly, we do know that all of these countries would be quite happy to take the United States down several pegs. I think the other thing that we see is, I think successive American administrations believed in the wake of World War II that economic liberalization would lead to political liberalization. And so we supported the G20. We supported, the G7 becoming the G8 and having Russia join. And we felt that increasing trade, increasing prosperity would lead to larger middle classes, would lead to political liberalization. And I think now almost no one believes that anymore. So it was like, whoops, okay, got that one wrong. But where does that leave us? What we see and what we've seen over the past 2.5 years, to bring it back to the first question about Ukraine, is it is impossible to separate these global hotspots, right? Because those 4 countries we mentioned, whether or not they comprise an axis of autocracy, all of them are helping Russia in this war. Russia is the major aggressor, but we talked about China helping them. North Korea and Iran are both sending weapons to Russia. And it therefore becomes very difficult to say, oh, we're too focused on Russia and not enough on China, the 21st century challenge. Well, there's a connection between these two. And we look today at what's playing out in the Middle East. And one of the many concerns has been, will this lead to a wider war? And it has seemed, at least for the moment, that maybe Iran doesn't want that wider war. But Iran is playing a role across these regions as well. So that is an enormous challenge for policymakers, but it also explains why we need to be also making sure that we have a robust security and defense policy, because we live in a dangerous world. And we are seeing connections across these global hotspots, and we are seeing countries who are plotting together to try to take advantage of what they see as American vulnerabilities and weakness. And this will also play a role in our election, because we know the Chinese and the Russians for sure, and also the North Koreans and the Iranians, are perpetuating information, misinformation, disinformation, to try to influence the election here and in Europe as well.
Great. Well, thank you very much. It's been a wide-ranging discussion, to put it mildly. But we now have 15 minutes or so for questions, if anybody has questions. And if you're going to ask a question, please wait for the mic to come, and please speak, clearly into it, because we have to make sure. It may sound like it's traversing this room, but it has to also get out to the people online. So all right, I have somebody
Thank
in
you
the
for
back
your
here.
remarks. They were very interesting. I want to preface what I'm going to say by qualifying it that I didn't vote for Trump. But the issue that he raised regarding NATO, I'm having trouble correlating the idea that your view of NATO, if I understand correctly, is one that would suggest is primarily a mutual support society focused on democratic values. Whereas I've always considered it to be what I believe the jargon in the country has been, a mutual defense organization. And since there's a direct correlation between the strength of the defense and the amount of spending, why is it not appropriate to make sure that everybody spends their share?
I'm so glad you asked that, because I don't want to be misunderstood. I think it is very important that everyone spend their fair share. But just to where you began, of course, at its core, NATO is a military alliance, but it is also a political alliance. And I think it's important to remember both of those aspects. So Russia, it's very interesting, because with the end of the Cold War, there was a growing relationship with Russia. I mentioned the G7 becoming the G8, but you also saw a Russia-NATO agreement that was about trying to increase relations with Russia and improve the tenor of those relationships. But given what Russia has done in recent years, that ended. We still have not abrogated that agreement with Russia, which I find quite interesting, and we can talk more about that. But fundamentally, NATO is a military and a political alliance. So yes, every NATO member needs to spend 2% of its GDP on defense. I don't think that is the only metric we should be looking at, because sometimes you can get to 2% by generous pensions for retired military. It matters what you're spending that money on. And so there are other metrics that measure that. Interestingly, the reason we have seen defense spending go up in Europe, we saw it go up after what Putin did in 2014, after he illegally annexed Crimea and took parts of the Donbass, eastern Ukraine. That's when we saw defense spending go up. So I think we are seeing that continue. We're seeing NATO members. Look at Poland. Poland is saying we're going to spend 4% of our GDP on defense. So yes, of course, we need to hold those members that aren't spending 2% of their GDP on defense. We need to hold their feet to the fire. But I am saying the deal is not, if you don't do that, you're no longer a NATO ally. If you're invaded by some foreign power, we're not going to help you. I don't think we make the security guarantee contingent on what percentage of GDP they spend on defense. Are we going to say, oh, Poland, we're going to defend you more robustly because you're spending 4%, and Germany, you're only spending 2%. So I just don't think that's how you quantify. I don't think you quantify the security commitment. That is there as a NATO member, and then we need to push and prod those members that aren't spending 2%. So that would be how I talk about that.
Thank you so much for the fantastic conversation. Considering the international society that we are seeing, so complicated with a world, so many different conflicts and challenges, I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about the importance to strengthen multilateral approaches. You have been talking about NATO, maybe also other international institutions, and at the same time, the transatlantic relationship between the European Union and the US. And also, I was curious about the wave of populism and nationalism, all these far-right political parties in all these countries in Europe and in the US. And I was wondering what's happening to the citizens? Why do they want to vote for those political parties? Are we facing a crisis of traditional political parties? Is that they don't know how to communicate? If you have time, thank you so much.
Yeah, well, the last question is really hard, and I feel like if I had an answer to that, it would solve a lot of problems. I mean, I think probably all of us in the room are struggling to understand that. And, you know, clearly, just to take the United States, and probably all of us have members of our family who are Trump supporters. And, you know, so when you talk to folks you know well and try to understand it, you know, there is a real sense that democracy isn't delivering for them, and that there are many established politicians who aren't listening to real concerns of Americans who feel that they're not benefiting economically. And they can say, okay, you can tell me the US economy is doing well, but when I go to the supermarket, the price of eggs is higher than it used to be, and my paycheck doesn't go as far. So, you know, I think it starts with trying to understand the concerns that Trump voters have and being responsive to those. But, you know, it's a huge challenge that I think we collectively are trying to deal with. You know, your question about other multilateral organizations, I mean, we are here in New York City, so let's start with the United Nations. And I will say, I found it so important, the role that the UN has played over the past 2.5 years. And I say that because I do think of it in many ways as the court of world opinion. And to see successive votes in the UN General Assembly where you consistently had 140, 141, 143 countries from around the world voting with Ukraine, supporting Ukraine, standing up for those principles in the UN Charter of sovereignty and territorial integrity. And, you know, you'd see 4, 5 countries voting with Russia. Now, there were countries also who hedged and abstained, and we have to understand that dynamic as well. But those 140 voting with Ukraine said to me that most countries in the world don't want to live in an order that doesn't have basic rules around which international politics flow. So I found that quite heartening, and also just I had the privilege of being in the UN Security Council for some of those sessions and hearing every countries seated around that table share their perspective on the conflict in Ukraine was also really enlightening. So I think we talk a lot about the global south, and no one's interested in that term. Everyone's looking for a better term, but no one has quite found it yet. You know, it was so apparent, the impact of the war in Ukraine on many countries around the world who depend on Ukraine for grain, who were affected by higher energy prices. And again, it comes back to this fact that a war on the European continent does have a global impact. And so the role of international institutions in how you manage this is actually quite profound. And then you asked about the US-EU relationship. I think it is extremely strong right now. I mean, if you look at, even when we have challenges in the relationship, like the Europeans saying, that Inflation Reduction Act, we really hate it. And we in the Biden administration were so surprised because we said, this is the most robust legislation the US has ever passed to deal with climate change and global warming. And they said, yeah, we like that, but we don't like the giant sucking sound of manufacturing jobs going to the US because of the subsidies you're paying. And so we sat down with the European Union, and Joe Biden very honestly said, I didn't intend this. I wasn't trying to harm Europe on this side. We want you to have robust manufacturing as well. Let's figure out how to solve this. But also in terms of dealing with 21st century challenges, I don't know if people noticed that the US and the EU set up a Trade and Technology Council to create a forum where the US and the EU can talk about technology and how are we thinking about tech in the 21st century? We often think about Europe as the regulatory superpower and the US as the innovation superpower. How do we try to better benefit from strengths on either side of the Atlantic? So I think we are in a very strong moment now, and the role the EU has played in terms of putting in place sanctions and export controls on Russia. The European Union, making a pledge to get 1 million rounds of ammo to Ukraine. They didn't meet their deadline of this March, but they're really trying to help step up military industrial production in Europe so that Europe is better positioned for the world that we're living in now. So anyway, high marks.
The Biden administration has not restored the Fulbright program in China and Hong Kong that President Trump halted. And last week, reports are that the Russians have halted the Fulbright program in Russia. At the same time, the German equivalent, the DAD, has been operating normally in China, whereas Fulbright has stopped, and is still operating, as far as I know, normally in Russia. What do you think the U.S. stance is towards international exchange of scholars and students in this tense situation, especially with perhaps China?
It's a great question, which I am not well positioned to answer. I had a wonderful colleague at the State Department who was still there, Lee Satterfield, who manages educational and cultural affairs and is the point person on these exchanges. So I don't know the specifics of why the program was halted when it was halted. In general, I personally am a big supporter of educational exchanges. I had the benefit of a DAAD scholarship and studied in Munich thanks to the DAAD. And I think those exchanges are so profoundly important in the lives of everyone who's had the benefit of doing that. And I should say my son, many years ago, was the recipient of a State Department fellowship to go to China. And in that summer, he was able to advance a full year in his Chinese. So I don't know what went into that, but clearly the educational and cultural exchange aspect of relationships is something that I'm confident, certainly Dan Crittenbrink, who's CISA's Secretary for the Asia Pacific, also thinks about, because it has a direct impact on the political relationship. But sorry not to be able to be more specific.
All right, since we had a short question and short answer, I'm going to let you ask the last one.
I know I'm normally long-winded. I'm sorry.
Short question.
Not that you can predict Vladimir Putin's next move, but I keep sort of wondering what his next move might be. And I keep thinking about, Moldova is just sitting there. That's a very easy, low-hanging fruit. He probably would have no resistance if he wanted to take that. Do you see a scenario where maybe he needs to have some political, he's not being successful in Ukraine to the populists in Russia, so he has to do something to show that he's still accomplishing something? Do you see Moldova as something that could easily be the next target for Putin? Or is it Georgia, or what do you think? And then what do you think NATO's response would be on those countries, either Moldova or Georgia?
Well, thanks for that. Clearly, Moldova is in a very vulnerable position. I will say, I think the best thing that maybe ever has happened to Moldova is that they currently have Maya Sandu as president. She is a very impressive leader. She is deeply concerned about what the Russians might do in Moldova. And of course, you've got Transnistria, part of Moldova that currently is occupied by Russians. Georgia, 20% of their territory is occupied by Russia. The Russians have said they're going to build new bases. In Georgia, you have a government that tends to lean in the Russian direction, but you have about 80% of Georgians who really want Georgia to be a member of the European Union. So you're seeing these domestic challenges in these countries. I don't see Putin going after Moldova now. In a sense, geography helps a little bit. I think he's very focused right now on consolidating and breaking the front line in eastern Ukraine. We know the Russians want to get Chasiv Yar, which is so I mentioned Avdiivka earlier, which is in Donetsk, that oblast. And if you go a little sort of east and north of there, there's a high point, Chasiv Yar. I think he's very focused on trying to break through the front lines there. And furthermore, I don't think he is worried about military success other places, because I think he feels like he's winning in Ukraine. I think he is very interested in what happens in our election in November. He also listens very closely to what Donald Trump says. He has heard Donald Trump criticize Joe Biden for putting Ukraine first and America last. He has heard Trump say that he would end the conflict in Ukraine in 24 hours. The only way that could happen is if there were enormous pressure put on Ukraine to cede maybe not only the territory Russia occupies, but Russia has annexed through its courts fully 4 oblasts that Russian forces don't fully occupy. So this clearly would be a bad deal for Ukraine and a good deal for Russia. So I think Putin right now is feeling pretty good. And that is not the outcome we want. So we have to keep up the pressure on Ukraine. And I think continue to hit that this is a war Russia started. I've had so many conversations with China, this is when I was in government, with Chinese officials, with others who find the Russian argument very compelling. And, I remind them of the history here. And this is really about Russia choosing to fight this war and believing it very quickly was going to be able to take over all of Ukraine and failing in that. But I think Putin still thinks time is on his side, and we need to prove him wrong.
On that note, I want to thank Karen Donfried for an incredibly wide-ranging discussion of contemporary affairs in Europe and beyond. And thank you all for coming. And I want to also thank, before you go, the team of Karen Sander in public programs here at the Graduate Center, and Tara McDonnell of Institutional Advancement, who's helped put this all together, along with Meryl Sovner, the Assistant Director of the EU Studies Center, who's really basically the reason this is happening. So thank you all for coming, and we look forward to seeing you again.